Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the final Centre for English Legal History seminar of Easter Term 2024. Firstly, a couple of quick reminders. We'll be recording this seminar for upload to the Centre's YouTube channel. And as usual, we will be heading to the ground for drinks and dinner. Professor Scott has kindly agreed to join us, and you're all very welcome. So this evening, we're delighted and privileged to have Professor Helen Scott presenting. Professor Scott is currently the Regius Professor of Civil Law here at the University of Cambridge, as well as Chair of Part 2 Examiners and a General Editor of the Cambridge Law Journal. She holds degrees from the University of Cape Town and the University of Oxford, and has also held senior teaching research and departmental positions at those universities. Professor Scott's research interests lie at the intersection of civilian legal history and the law of obligations, especially tort and unjust enrichment. Among her many publications in these areas, she is the author of Unjust Enrichment in South African Law, Rethinking Enrichment by Transfer, and the co-editor of Inuria and the Common Law and Private Law in a Changing World. This evening, she will be presenting Complicity in Furtum, Digest 47 to 52, 19 to 24 in context. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scott.
Thank you so much. You'll see I've cheekily snuck in a late stage title change, but I don't think it makes any difference. It's just a little bit more interesting than the original one. Thank you. And also thank you very much to everyone who's here for three reasons. Firstly, because this was supposed to happen last week and didn't. Secondly, because we're in, for many of you, the middle or the final stages of a terrible push towards marking. And finally, because the weather is so horrible. So I'm very grateful to everyone who's come in person. And of course, it's lovely to see people online as well. So what I've done, I've created something which is somewhere between a handout or an outline and a summary of the paper. It's about 5 pages long. And I think, Ros, that you circulated it, but it's also very helpfully up on the projector. I'm just wondering, how will I scroll using this mouse, right? Sorry, I should have established that before we began. So I will try and keep pace with my talk so that those of you who don't have a copy can just see what I'm doing. And because it's so terrifically large, you should be able to see what's going on. All right, so the stimulus for the piece, and I hope he's not embarrassed since he's sitting here, is a piece written by David in 1994 called The Danger of Definition, Contractatio and Appropriation. And these are ideas that I first encountered when I did the BCL, and David was my tutor in the year 2000. And the piece, for those of you who don't know it, does two things. It defends a famous passage in Digest 47.2, that's 47.2.21, against the charge of being irredeemably corrupt. But it also builds an argument foreshadowed or indicated in the title, which is that whereas contractatio was a necessary condition for liability and was the element, the chosen physical element in the famous definition of Paul that I'm going to come to in a moment, the popular conception of theft as carrying something away or taking something away, asportatio or amotio, continued to inform the scope of the delict. So David argues that as the physical element of the delict became increasingly attenuated, the mental element became more and more clearly delineated in order to hold the boundaries of that popular conception of theft, theft is taking in place. And in particular here, of course, the element of lucri faciendi gratia is very important intention to make again. But he also explains that sometimes it was necessary to grasp the nettle. And so in 47.2.21 itself, it seems that Ulpian was prepared to deny liability, even though both contractatio and animus ferandi were present, at least on some facts. Now, the paper I'm going to present now is both inspired by and closely aligns with what David said there, in two senses. Firstly, I've tried to emulate his method in that paper in offering what I call a sympathetic and imaginative, but not too imaginative, reading of another Ulpianic text, which is this one, 47 to 52, 19 to 24. So in terms of method, I hope I've done what he did there. But in substantive terms as well, I've tried to develop or take further some of David's ideas in that piece. So the piece I'm going to offer now really entails two wider questions, in addition to the close reading of the text itself that I hope to offer. The first one is, how was Book 37 of Ulpian's edictal commentary organized? And the second one, what was Ulpian's conception of theft? So proceeding from there, the paper starts with a section that reviews what I've called the edictal element in Digest 47.2. So as many people know, the first fragment in Digest 47.2 is a passage taken from Paul's commentary on the Edict, Book 39. This is the passage that concludes with the definition that I've already quoted. And indeed, the last fragment of the title is also edictal. This is 47.293. It's also taken from Ulpian's commentary on the Edict. And this is the passage in which Ulpian tells us rather dispiritingly that everything we've just heard is more or less irrelevant, because it's far more usual to bring criminal proceedings than it is to bring the acte offerti, although, of course, the definition was important there too, it seems. But actually, this edictal framing is a bit misleading, because if you look at the texts that make up Digest 47.2, what you find is that the first 2/3 is very largely drawn from Ulpian and Paul ad Sabinum. What you've got is a sort of almost a conversation between Ulpian and Paul. The compilers have created the impression of an exchange between them, because they've interleaved Paul ad Sabinum with Ulpian ad Sabinum, with some important contributions from Gaius, commentary on the provincial edict, and Pomponius, commentary on Sabinus. So these two texts, Paul and Ulpian's edictal commentaries, and I'm mainly talking about Book 9 of Paul and Book 41 of Ulpian, these are interleaved in the way I've described, all the way up to about 47 to 48. But immediately after that, we encounter a cluster of texts which, like the framing texts in 47.2.1 and 47.2.93, are edictal rather than Sabinian. So we have a long piece of Ulpian Book 37, from which my text is taken. That appears in 47.2.50 and 47.2.52. Then there's a shorter passage from Book 38 of Ulpian's edictal commentary, that's in 53. And then a longer passage from Book 39 of Paul's edictal commentary, that's 47.2.54. These are the same works from which the bracketing texts that I mentioned a moment ago come. The same committee appears to have read both the Sabinian and the edictal works, but it doesn't necessarily appear that the same people on the committee read these two groups of works. In other words, the Sabinian works on the other hand, on the one hand, and the edictal on the other. So we have to be very careful when we speculate about the concerns that drove the composition of 47.2 and just how much mutual awareness there was across this particular committee, where the people who read the edictal works talking to the people who read the Sabinian works, and how much integration was there between them. But nevertheless, in the paper, I asked the question, why did the compilers choose to include these portions from what I've called the edictal works, and in particular, 47 to 50 and 52? Why did they include these particular extracts in Digest 47.2? There is quite considerable overlap between the subject matter of this passage, the Ulpianic edictal passage in 50 and 52, and the first half of the title, which is I explained is Sabinian. But the extract preserved at 50 and 52 is distinctive because it addresses in detail a topic which is only very briefly touched on earlier in the title, and that is the topic of complicity. And in particular, what we find there is a sustained analysis of the mental state and the conduct which is necessary to sustain accomplice liability. And that, I think, is something we don't find in the Sabinian material And so I tentatively suggest that that is why it's there. Now, in the paper itself, I offer a close reading of the entirety of this section, 47 to 51 through to 47 to 50:24. And I do that in 3 sections, of which the first is 51 to 4. And then I move to 52 principium through 18. And finally, then I reach 52:19 to 24. Now, for reasons of time, and also because I just think it's uncongenial, I'm not going to go into detail on all parts of this text, but I am going to briefly speak about this section, 51 to 4, and then I'm going to skip to the text, which is the main subject of my paper tonight. So 47 to 50 begins actually with a very interesting discussion of damages in the context of the Acta 30. But in fact, for Otto Lenel in his Palingenesia, it was at 51 that Ulpian began to comment on the wording of the formula of the Acta 30. And rather unfairly, I've given you the words of that formula in Latin only. And the reason I've done that is because because of the word order, rather difficult to translate this. But this is the part of the formula that Lenel thought dealt with complicity. So the words opeve, concilio, indicating that this is a section of the formula that Lenel understood to be devoted to the question of accomplice liability. And the text that I've given you here is essentially the one that Lenel gives in the Palingenesia, but it's actually the one taken from Dario Mantovani's, the second edition of Mantovani in 1999, which is essentially the same as Lenel's one. So the text goes like this, and I'll just read through it briefly. Let me just bring that up on the screen. So Celsus says that a theft has been committed with one's help and advice, not only if what one did was in order to enable one's associates to steal, but also if one did it not in order to enable one's associates to steal, but rather for the sake of ill will. Hedius rightly says that just as no one can commit theft without wrongful intent, equally no one can offer either help or advice without wrongful intent. A person is deemed to give advice who persuades and directs and provides advice in order to get a theft committed. And the word advice there, of course, is translating concilium. He gives ops, help, who provides aid or assistance in the taking of things. And finally, an actio 30 lies against he who waved a red flag and put cattle to flight so that they fell into the hands of thieves, if indeed he did it with wrongful intent, dolo malo. But even if he did not do it for the purpose of committing theft, such a destructive game, a lusus perniciosus, should not go unpunished. And for this reason, Labia writes that an actium factum should be given. So it seems here obvious that Ulpian is concerned with the mental state that we need to render someone who in fact enables another to steal an accomplice to theft. So Celsus seems to have thought that an act that actually enabled another to steal amounted to complicity, even where that was not the intention of the accessory. In other words, even where the accessory was motivated by ill will towards the owner of the thing. But Hedius thought that you needed rather something he calls dolus malus, just as you needed it to constitute theft. And that was the view that Ulpian preferred. And so in the case we get in 54, where someone sets cattle running with the result that they fall into the hands of thieves, the person who does the chasing is only liable to an actio 30 insofar as he acted with the purpose of committing theft. If his mental state is a lesser one, playing of a destructive game, liability arises only in factum. And I haven't given you the texts here, but in a number of texts elsewhere in the digest and indeed in Gaius's Institutes, it's strongly suggested that this action is modeled on the actio legis Aquiliae. I'm thinking of Gaius 3:202. And indeed, the text that immediately follows this one in the digest, that's 47:251. It's a Gaius text. It makes that quite explicit. So much for the first tranche of texts. In the paper, what follows now is a detailed exposition of the second tranche of texts. Now, as I've indicated on my outline/summary, Lenel thought that up into 52:6, Ulpin continued to be busy with his commentary on the complicity part of the formula of the Actio 30 Nec Manifesti, and that at 52.7, he made an important transition from that complicity part to the words in the formula which specify that theft must have been committed, furtum factum esse. And Lenel thought that ran all the way up to 52.24. That's the end of my passage today, so a very long chunk of text. In other words, Lenel thought that the texts I'm discussing today, running from 51 through to 52.24, were divided more or less in half, or maybe in a third and two-thirds, between a passage that dealt with complicity and something that dealt with more general questions of the conception of theft. But as I try and show in the paper, I don't think that that is right. And I do that by very carefully parsing the texts that appear in this section. I should admit that it's not always easy to follow Ulpin's train of thought in this passage, as I say on the handout, and that may or may not be because the text has been shortened by the compilers. But as I say here, I think there are a number of central themes. Ulpin is interested in questions of standing and liability under the Actio 30 Nec Manifesti. A lot of the cases he discusses involve multiple potential plaintiffs or more than one wrongdoer. And the latter category, of course, comprises complicity. So we find further cases of complicity in this tranche of texts, which, of course, we've already met in 51-4. Prominent throughout is a sort of minor key, texts in which the defendant purports to be someone other than they are, or purports to have a different status to the one they really have, or acts for themselves when really bound to act for another. So that's the subject of at least, it seems to be 5 texts within the tranche I'm currently discussing. Some of these cases only involve 2 parties, but because they're cases about simulation or dissimulation, that seems to bring them into line with cases involving multiple plaintiffs or wrongdoers. And at the same time, those cases seem to me to form a sort of a bridge to the 2-party cases that we also find. What they all seem to have in common, at least a large number of them, including the complicity cases, seem to have in common to me, is that they involve a defendant who has not stolen according to the popular conception of theft. Someone who has not taken away or carried off a thing belonging to the plaintiff, but who is nevertheless liable to the Actio 30. And here I'm circling back to the piece with which we began. It seems to me that Ulpin is here testing where the boundaries of his conception of theft might fall. And I'll say more about that towards the end of the paper. So in short, what these themes suggest to me is that rather than, as Lenel argued, there being 2 quite distinct sections here, the first one speaking to complicity and the second to the question of what amounts to theft for the purposes of the Actio 30, what we're really dealing with here is a single integrated analysis. And indeed, it may be that Lenel had the wording of the Actio 30 Nec Manifesti wrong, that he was relying on a flawed reading of the text of that action that we seem to get in Book 4 of Gaius's Institutes. And recently, about 10 years ago, Johannes Platschek argued that in truth, the formula of the Actio was rather different from the one that Lenel had in front of him when he built this argument. And that specifically, it did not include any reference to complicity at all. So I've given you Platschek's reconstruction here. If Platschek is right, and it seems to be, to me, a compelling argument, then it may well be that everything we have in the texts I'm talking about today, so everything through from 47 to 51, all the way through 47 to 52:18, is all about one thing, which are the words quod furtum factum est, that theft has been committed, and indeed everything running from 18 through to 24 is about the same thing. So this is a unitary analysis. And that is one of the sort of the key points that I try and make in the piece. But now I'm coming on to the meat of my paper today, which is the meaning of this difficult section from 52:19 to 24. Now, again, my argument is that Ulpin is still engaged in an integrated analysis at 52:19, where this section begins. Now, I'm going to put this up on the screen now. I'm afraid it's divided in half. Let me see if I can put a, no, I'll just have to scroll, sorry. Wait a minute, I'm going to try and put a page break in here so you can see the whole thing at once, sorry. Ah, brilliant. Okay, so there's the text. It is widely suspected of being heavily interpolated. Most people who've written on this in the last 100 years have thought that the text is about the meaning of contractatio, that Ulpin is really exploring the meaning of contractatio in this passage. And that's not surprising because it starts with a section that strongly suggests that one commits theft neither by word nor by writing, for our rule is that theft cannot occur without contractatio. So that sentence itself does seem to give the impression that we're primarily concerned here with contractatio as an element of theft liability. And what follows then is understood as a series of examples designed to illustrate the operation of this contractatio rule. But as I've argued, I don't think that's what's happening here. I think Ulpin is still exploring the themes that he identified in 50 and in 52, Principium through to 18. And in particular, what I think he's interested in are the conditions under which someone can be held liable to the active fati as an accomplice, alongside the wider question of when a person who has not stolen in the lay sense of the word can nevertheless be held liable for theft. So that is a rather different reading of the passage to the one that's usually attributed to it. Now, I've given you a translation of the passage on the handout, or rather on the screen. And as I indicate in the footnotes, I'm indebted to Ben for help with this passage and several others. But since he's sitting here, I'll thank him in person. I'm not going to read it, but I'm just going to paraphrase it for you. So if we just move past the abstract proposition in 19, we move on to what seems to be a set of 4 cases. So we've got one which seems to derive from Ulpin's own experience, which is the one that's discussed in 20, about the mares and the donkey, the one that Modestinus sent him from Dalmatia. And then we have 3 more that seem to have been proverbial because they're much discussed by other jurists, so they seem to have a longer history. 5220 is the case of the theft of stud services, maybe fatum usus, or perhaps it's the theft of the semen of the plaintiff's animals, or perhaps it's the theft of the genetic material of the plaintiff's male animal. So the story is this: one man drives another's donkey to his own mares, or in the more difficult variant case, submits his stallions to another's mares, for the purpose of insemination. And it's said in respect of both these variant cases that the owner of the female animals will be liable for theft only insofar as he acted with theftuous intent, animus ferandi. Now, these references to intention are widely suspected of having been interpolated. And some commentators, among them, I think Peter Burks, go further and say, well, what Ulpin originally said was that there would be no liability unless there was contractatio. So the compilers have taken out the word contractatio and put in the word animus ferandi. Then in 5221, someone, you, persuades another person, that's I, to lend money to a third person by presenting him as honorable Titius, when in fact he is penniless Titius. And you and Titius share out the money between them. You is said to be liable on the basis that the theft is being committed with his help and advice, ope consilio, but Titius is also liable for theft. And again, this one is often thought to be interpolated. People think that the reference to complicity might be interpolated, or that the reference to sharing the money might be interpolated. And the reason they think that is because otherwise you end up with 2 contractationes. Both wrongdoers seem to have handled the money, and so it seems wrong that one of them is identified as an accomplice only. That doesn't seem to fit with what we understand, how we understand theft to work. Then in 5222, we have the case of the weights, well known to many of you, I'm sure. Someone lends weights that are too heavy, heavier than indicated, to another, that's another you, who then goes shopping in the market. It's said, at least by Meller, that the lender of the weights is liable for theft, even where the purchaser is innocent. So in other words, even in the absence of any kind of relationship of complicity between them, or indeed any theft on the part of the purchaser. If we take that seriously, then it seems as if the lender's conduct must itself amount to theft, to contractatio, because the purchaser is innocent. They don't have any animus ferandi. So that would seem to give contractatio a very strained meaning, so some commentators say, and therefore I think it is also suspected either as interpolated or as some sort of late gloss. And then finally in 23, if someone persuades my slave to remove the wrongdoer's debt, literally a nomen, perhaps a name, from a document evidencing a sale, with the result that my contractual claim against him is effectively extinguished because it can no longer be enforced in the absence of evidence. Both Meller and Ulpin thought that these facts would give rise to a theft action. But we have something different. In 24, here the slave is just persuaded to transcribe the document, and here Ulpian tells us that the actio servi corrupti will lie otherwise the actio de dolo. And here again, many commentators from Lenel onwards have been skeptical about this text. They say it shows that Ulpian is indifferent to contractatio. Even Lenel thought that much of the second half of 24 was interpolated. So overall, if you read these cases as a series of illustrations of what contractatio may or may not mean, they seem to, the whole result is a rather messy one. And it's for that reason, I think, that these texts are often suspected of having been distorted by the compilers, who it is said had a much wider view of contractatio than Ulpian and accorded much greater prominence to intent. But if we return to the integrated analysis that I've tried to present, if we admit the possibility that this text, 52:19 to 24, is part of a wider integrated analysis, one that's coherent, I think we see a clearer argument emerging. And here I think we need to look back to, sorry, there's all my interpolation references. I think we need to look back to what happened in 51 to 4. So you remember in 51 to 4, Ulpian's focus was on the mental state of accomplices. So he said, Pedius rightly says that just as no one commits theft without wrongful intent, equally no one can offer assistance, complicity without wrongful intent. So that passage dealt with the mental state of accomplices. And this one, the one we're looking at now, 19 to 24, this one deals with the conduct necessary to sustain liability in cases involving accomplices or accomplice-like figures. So according to the second sentence of 52:19, which I haven't actually read to you yet, for this reason, providing opem, ops, or giving advice, concilium, likewise imports liability, nocet, only when contractatio has followed. Because, as we saw in the first sentence, there can be no theft without contractatio. Contractatio is at least a necessary condition for theft. So it seems to me that Ulpian is essentially picking up here where he left off in 54. And it doesn't seem to be an accident that the conduct that's at issue in the very next text in 20 is the same conduct that we left off in 54. It's chasing. So we're chasing animals, and they're hence the title of my piece. In a standard complicity scenario, a kind of straightforward civil law 1 case, the necessary contractatio is provided by another person, one we might anachronistically refer to as a principal thief. And that's certainly the only plausible reading of cases like 21, where we have trickery or persuasion deployed on the plaintiff or on another wrongdoer, or indeed on the object of the theft in order to get the theft committed. And the reason for that is that you can't commit theft without doing something. You can't commit theft by word or writing. That's where we started. That's what Ulpian said in 19. And so in a case of trickery, lying or persuasion, it seems quite obvious that that person can't be providing the contractatio, someone else has to be. But that assumption is a lot less secure when the intervention of the accomplice figure goes beyond words or writing. So where we're speaking about cases that go beyond words or writing, acts of complicity can themselves amount to contractatio as negatively defined by Ulpian in this text. So it's that issue, I think, which is locating the necessary contractatio in a complicity scenario. That's what Ulpian is interested in 19 to 24. And again, in considering this difficult question, he's not just looking at cases of actual complicity, cases where you've got two wrongdoers, but also cases that involve only one wrongdoer, albeit cases where the theft is accomplished by more than one actor, whether that's a human actor or a non-human actor. Well, what do I mean? Let me take you through the remainder of the text in a bit more detail. So I've already mentioned 20. This is the case of the chasing. Sorry, I'm going to go back up to it. So here there's only one wrongdoer. That's the owner of the female animals. And to the extent that he's liable for theft, it must therefore be he who's providing the necessary contractatio, either by chasing another's donkey to his mares or by driving his own mares to another's stallions. Now, as we saw when I talked about 47-250 a moment ago, the chaser in the first case discussed in 47-254, that was the red rag case, he was liable only insofar as he set the plaintiff's animal running so that it might fall into the hands of thieves. And it seems to me, sorry, that is why Ulpian is emphasizing intention so heavily here. Remember, this was the bit that was suspected by Peter Bergs and others of being interpolated. But I think if you see this text as following on directly from 47-254, it makes perfect sense. The fact that the chaser in our story intends to steal to make a gain for himself is important because it explains why this is still a case of theft, even without the involvement of a third party. Now, in the second variant, where I drive my own mares to your stallions, the contractatio, the chasing, is even more remote from any gain that the chaser might hope to make. And it's therefore unsurprising, at least to me, that Ulpian once again emphasizes the chaser's mental state, repeating that everything depends on establishing an animus ferandi. But despite this mental state, as a mere chaser, whether of another's animals or his own, the defendant in this story seems to be cast in the role of an accomplice. It's a quirk of these particular facts, which arises from the capacity of these animals to move themselves, that both these things can be true at once. So he has a theftless intention, but his actions more closely resemble complicity. And I think that introducing this case, Ulpian is trying to make the point that the contractatio that you need to give rise to liability under the Actio Furti can be provided by one in an apparently accessorial role. If we move to the next case, which is 21, here there are two wrongdoers and two potential defendants to the Actio Furti. And there's not much ambiguity in the case. It's much more straightforward than the one we were just looking at. You've got mere speaking. So according to Ulpian's own definition, the person who does the persuading can't be held, or rather the lying, can't be held liable, can't be held to have committed a contractatio. That's not plausible, even according to the definition that Ulpian is operating. And therefore, that's the person who does the lying, is said to be liable on the basis only that the theft has been committed with his help and advice, and Titius is also liable. It seems that Titius, regarding whose identity the victim, I, is mistaken, commits theft despite the fact that I gives him the money. So Titius has just accepted the coins. But we're told that nevertheless, this is theft. And in fact, the way for this has already been prepared in two texts preceding this one, in 52:15 and 52:17. I didn't talk about those, but this issue we've already encountered at least once and maybe twice in the intervening section that I spoke about a moment ago. Having said that, on closer examination, again, this text seems to me to turn out to be less straightforward than it first appears. So one reason it's not straightforward is one I've already indicated. So both Titius and you seem to commit contractatio of the money, because we assume that Titius hands back some of the coins to you. And that seems a little odd, and we might therefore think that the case is telling us that providing contractatio doesn't necessarily mean you're not liable purely as an accomplice. So that would almost be the converse of the previous case. But here another difficulty arises. Like the wrongdoer in 20, the chaser, the mental state of you, that's the liar, is not really that of an accomplice at all. He's more like a thief, or anachronistically, a principal thief. He's the author of the scheme, committing theft on his own account. So he's said to share the coins with Titius, who accepts them. So it's really Titius who's presented to the victim by you, the liar. It's really him who seems to be playing the role of accomplice. So again, it seems to me that the relationship between contractatio and animus ferandi and complicity in this case is very much less than straightforward. The third case, this is the case of the weights. Here, the facts are a bit stronger. It's like 20 because here, the person who lends the weights, although he's apparently in an accessorial role, he's the only possible defendant in the picture. At least in the first version of the story, there's no principal thief because the person who purchases the goods in the market doesn't know what's going on, so they can't possibly be providing a contractatio. The case does involve lying because the false markings on the weights seem to represent lies, just like the lies about the identity of Titius did. But the facts are stronger, as I've said, because here, lending the weights goes beyond mere speaking or writing. It's stronger than the conduct of you in the previous text in 21. And it's presumably for this reason, or something like this reason, that Meller thought that the lender of the weights could be liable for theft, even where the purchaser was innocent. Just as the chaser of the animals could be liable for theft, even in the absence of another actor in 20. Admittedly, Orpin doesn't seem to agree with Meller's view of this first variant. There's a clear contrast with 23, where he says, where he explicitly agrees with Meller. And this isn't very surprising because unlike the chaser in 20, or indeed you in 21, the person who's lending the weights intends to facilitate a gain on the part of the purchaser. He's not trying to make a gain on his own account. And in fact, it's arguable that he lacks any theftuous intent at all. He's maybe like the chaser in the second alternative in 54, the one who's engaging in a destructive game of chasing cattle, or you can think of peacocks here if you like, or the person discussed by Celsus in 51, who acts just through ill will towards the owner of the goods. So the case is a weak one for that reason. I think the mental state is off. But Orpin doesn't disclaim Meller's view, and I think he doesn't do that because this case is useful to him, or at least consistent with his analysis. And I think that as in 20, I'm sorry, in 22, Orpin is trying to make a rather counterintuitive point, which is that the contractatio that you need to provide theft can be provided by one in an apparently accessorial role, even on facts as weak as these. Now, what about the second alternative? Here, the seller's mistake as to the amount of grain he's handing over entails theft on the part of the purchaser, despite this being a case of giving rather than taking. So as in 21, we assume that Yu's conduct amounts to a contractatio, and the vitiation of the victim's intention in handing over some of the flour or the money or the grain, the vitiation of his intention, the mistake that he's suffering from, means that ownership in that extra part doesn't pass to the recipient. It's very difficult to analyze these facts because we're not actually told what we're talking about. I think it's left open. So the precise mechanism by which ownership does or doesn't pass, the possibility of commixty or confusio is rather unclear to me. But it seems to me that seems to be what is meant there, and the argument is rather stronger in the paper, because there I draw links with other texts earlier in this passage where I think the same thing might be going on. It's not entirely clear whether he steals everything that's handed to him or just some of the things that are handed to him, to the extent that he receives extra grain or whatever it is attributable to the seller's error. But in this case, we get something we don't get in the other cases where this sort of thing is discussed, and that is a reason. We're told the reason is, for you do not acquire, you do not accept it in accordance with the will of the seller, ex voluntate venditoris, for he is an error as the way. So that's an extra element that we don't get in 21, or indeed in 15 or 11, where these sorts of issues are also discussed. So here we seem to have two contractationes. It's rather like 21 in that respect. But unlike in 21, both the actors are liable in their own right, rather than the lenders merely being liable as an accomplice. And that, of course, seems to be attributable to the nature of his intervention. It's not clear to me that there's any cooperation between the parties at all, even in the second alternative. It seems to me that they might be quite independent actors. We're not told that they're in league with each other. So the facts could be rather different from 21 in that respect. We could have two quite independent contractationes by two people who are not acting together at all. That leads me finally to the last case dealt with in 23 and then in 24. Now, here again, we have two wrongdoers, but this time we only have one defendant, because the slave, who is the property of the victim, can't be sued by him, just as the wrongdoer's animals in 20 couldn't be sued by him. Now, unlike the chaser in 20 and the lender in 22, but like you in 21, here the defendant's conduct, which is mere persuading, can't constitute contractatio. It's mere speaking, not something more. Only the slave, who removes the defendant's debt or name from the document of purchase, can plausibly be said to have committed contractatio. Again, deleting text goes beyond mere speaking or writing. And in fact, we get quite a detailed account of a case of this kind in 47.2.27, which I've included on my outline. I'm not going to read this text through now. I haven't even given it all to you here. It's a really, to me, fascinating discussion of the way damages are calculated when tablets are stolen, and in particular whether the amount of the debt evidenced in the tablet might be included in the damages. The bit that I haven't given you deals with an ingenious argument, which is this: if you can prove your damages for the purposes of the actio furti, how is it that you've sustained any difficulty? Because then you don't have a problem, because you don't need the paragraph anyway. Paul was persuaded by that argument in another text that I haven't given you here. But we're not interested in that. We are only interested in 47.2.27.3, where Ulpin goes on to say, but if a person doesn't remove documents of this kind, but merely strikes out text, not only the actio furti will lie, but also the actio legis equilii. So it seems to me that that is very close to the case we have in mind here. And it seems that deleting text from a document that provides evidence of a debt can, at least in some circumstances, give rise to a claim for damages that incorporates the amount of the debt, not just the value of the paper. And we contrast that with the next text, 24, sorry, I'm going to scroll back up again, where we're told that if the slave merely copies or transcribes the tablets, then we're out of the scope of the actio furti. Then it's just servi corruptio or perhaps dolus. Okay. So 23 looks more like 21. The slave is committing the theft by deleting the name of the defendant from the tablet, and the defendant is a mere accomplice. So they appear to be very similar structurally. Again, I don't think the case is so straightforward. First, unlike you, the liar in 21, it's not clear to me that the defendant in 23 is committing any act of complicity. it doesn't seem that what he's doing, which is persuading the slave to remove his name from a document, amounts to complicity as Orpin understood it. So this is takes us into a rather difficult series of texts. The first of which is 47-236 Principium. I've put that there. A man who persuades a slave to run away is not a thief, for a man who gives another bad advice no more commits theft than one who advises another to throw himself from a height or to kill himself. These things do not give rise to an action for theft. Now, Justinian, in the next text, 4111, seems to have interpreted this text, the exclusion of this case, persuading a slave to steal. He seems to have seen this text as authority for the proposition that persuading someone to steal never constituted concilium, complicity for the purposes of theft. So he says it's certain that a person who has not assisted in the commission of a theft, but has only given advice, concilium David, and urged hortatus est, the commission of the theft, is not liable for theft. So that would seem to suggest, beyond doubt, actually, that the case we're dealing with can't be concilium. The difficulty there is that if you remember 47-250, you'll remember that the definition of concilium that Orpin gave there is difficult to reconcile with this reading of 47-236. So remember, he said a person is deemed to give advice, concilium, who persuades and directs and provides advice in order to get a theft committed. Now, again, that's very difficult to reconcile with what Justinian seems to have thought. And so it may be that in 36, Orpin was making a quite different point, which is that a slave who runs away paradigmatically doesn't steal himself, just as a slave who kills himself doesn't steal himself. And therefore, persuading him to do that can't be complicity because there is no principal theft to be complicit in. So that would be a rather different sort of point. Having said that, I think if we pay careful attention to the formulation in 47-253, that might tip the matter the other way. So what he says is, a person is deemed to give concilium who persuades and directs and provides advice in order to get the theft committed. So it seems to me that what Orpin has in mind here primarily is a case like the one described in 52-21, where it's the persuading of I by you to lend the money that enables Titius to carry out the theft. Or it's like a case described later in 47-236, where I persuade a slave to run away so that another may intercept him. So for Orpin, those are definitely cases of concilium because they get the theft done. They are instrumental in accomplishing the theft. And on the other hand, it seems that for Orpin, just persuading a slave to steal was servi corruptio rather than theft. I think I've omitted to give you that text, but it is 11:3:15. One also makes a slave worse if one persuades him to commit inuria or furtum or to run away. So one commits servi corruptio if one persuades a slave to run away. So Orpin seems to have thought that was servi corruptio. We end up then with a rather finely balanced picture. And the question is, on what side of the line does the case in 52-23 lie? So we could say that the defendant has just urged the slave to act. But it seems to me that that's not quite right, because the defendant's intervention goes beyond mere persuasion to commit theft. It's through persuading the slave to remove the defendant's name from the document that theft has been accomplished, at least if we understand the theft to have occurred in respect of the sum evidenced in the document. But if we take this view, I think we encounter a still greater difficulty, which is that unlike the actions of Titius in 21, the slave's actions here do not in themselves clearly amount to stealing at all. So the slave handles the document, but his intention in deleting the defendant's name from it is to enable the defendant to gain, not to gain on his own account. The slave doesn't have any interest in the document in the sense identified by Orpin in 47-227. It has value only to the victim of the theft, who's the creditor, and of course to the defendant, who's the debtor, the thief himself. So what are we to make of all of this? One possibility is that we're dealing here with a case involving two accomplices, one of whom provides concilium, accompanied by animus ferandi, and the other of whom provides ops, physical assistance, accompanied by the intention to enable another to steal. Or, and this is my view, ulpin means to suggest that while the slave is an accomplice, it's the defendant who commits theft, having stolen the sum evidenced in the document. After all, unlike in 21, ulpin doesn't say that he's liable merely ope consilio. So in fact, in some respects, this case is like the first alternative in 22. There, the person who gained committed no contractatio, while the person who provided the contractatio made no gain, nor did he intend to do so. He only intended to help the defendant to gain. Again, Meller's view that this could be theft was merely reported by ulpin, which suggests that ulpin was rather uncomfortable with Meller's view of that case in the first half of 22. But here in 23, it's a bit different because here, like the chaser in 20 and the persuader in 21, the defendant clearly has animus ferandi in the sense of an intention to gain. And it seems to me the animus ferandi of the defendant in 23 that's making the difference. And that's why ulpin agreed with Meller that a theft action was available on these facts. Remember, the slave belonged to the victim. So if a theft action was available, it must have been available against the persuader. Now, you might be thinking that's very improbable because there is simply no contractatio at all that can be detected on the part of the defendant. And ulpin himself seems to have had some doubts about this because he introduced this section, this case, by saying, I at least think, ego puto, I think at least. I think that suggests some anxiety or diffidence about that conclusion. But it does seem to me that ulpin is advancing here, and specifically in this passage, a quite revolutionary proposition. So building on the points that he'd made in 20 and 22, that you could provide contractatio even if you were in an accessorial role, but subverting the expectations that had been engendered by 21, where the defendant was the accomplice and the slave was the principal. Here, instead, he demonstrates that contractatio was neither necessary or sufficient to make you a thief. It was enough to give rise to actio furti that there was a contractatio somewhere in the picture, even if it was supplied by an accomplice. And after all, that is what ulpin said in 52:19. One commits theft neither by word nor writing, for our rule is that theft cannot occur without contractatio. For this reason, providing help or advice likewise imports liability only when contractatio has followed. I think that very strange and personal formulation is significant. The contractatio has to occur. It doesn't have to be provided by the thief. All right, so that was some rather dense textual analysis. I then offer some conclusions on the basis of what I've said to you today and what I say in the paper. Just to sum those up, it seems to me that the passage that we've been looking at now, 52:19 to 24, contains an analysis of an important and difficult question, which was what conduct was necessary to sustain liability in cases involving accomplices. Ulpin considers three kinds of conduct in particular. That is, as per the title of the paper, chasing, lying, and persuading. And incidentally, it seems to me that there is an echo here of the triad of force, trickery, and persuasion, bia, dolos, and peithor, that we find in, for example, in Sophocles and Philoctetes, and indeed throughout ancient Greek tragedy and history. And it seems that for ulpin too, these represented the three essential modes by which human beings act on each other. So examining these three ideas entailed an examination of the borderline between the actio furti, nec manifesti on the one hand, and the actio doli and actio servi corruptio on the other. That was the business of the passage we've just been looking at. The linked question of what mental state you needed to be in order to have accomplice liability, that had already been dealt with in 51 to 4. And here the relevant borderline was between the actio infractum and the actio, or the actio infractum modeled on the actio legis equiliae and the actio furti. And then in the middle section, we've got further analysis of who could bring the actio furti, against whom, and in respect of what. So what we have here again is a sort of integrated analysis, which is essentially procedural in focus. It's about the active 30, when it lies, against whom, and at whose instance. As I've indicated briefly on the handout, it seems to me that the close reading of Ulpian's text that I've offered here vindicates many of the views offered by Tony Honoré in his book, Ulpian, the second edition. In particular, I think we see abundant evidence of what he calls Ulpian's oral style, and what he calls Ulpian's empirical method. It's really a masterclass in the Ulpianic method. We see the way in which Ulpian interacts with the views of his predecessors, the way in which he reasons by analogy using an antiphonal structure of paired texts. I think that is exactly what's going on here, and I think it's quite clear, actually, if we pay attention to the fact complex in 52:20 through to 24. It seems to me that it would be difficult to find something this sophisticated in contemporary Anglophone legal scholarship. But on the other hand, the degree of integration that I think we can see in Ulpian's analysis casts doubt on Lainell's understanding of this text 52:50 through to 52, insofar as Lainell seemed to think that it consisted of self-contained commentaries on successive portions of the text of the Active 30 Nec Manifesti. I don't think these sections are discrete from one another, and from that we can draw the inference that the entirety of the passage pertained to a single phrase, probably furtum factum esse, as in Placzek. Or more boldly, we might think that the commentary on the Active 30 is not lemmatic at all. That he's just talking about the formula. He's just talking about the Active 30 Nec Manifesti. There's no lemmatic element to this at all. I'm not convinced that these texts substantiate that view. Finally, despite its predominantly procedural focus, as I've said on my handout, I think we can draw some quite powerful substantive conclusions from this text, and in particular the text I've focused on today, 47 to 52, 19 to 24. So as we've seen, contractatio for Ulpian was a condition for liability. It wasn't the gist of the wrong of furtum. So what was Ulpianic furtum? Well, none of the characters in the text we've been looking at has committed anything like stereotypical theft in the sense of taking something away or carrying something off. But each of them has obtained something, the stud or the money or the extra goods or the debt, from the plaintiff. And as Ulpian spelled out in 22, the case of the Waits, this was theft precisely because they didn't accept these things in accordance with the will of the seller. Now, of course, we could simply say that Ulpian is making the point here that there's contractatio because there's no effective traditio of the goods. So because there's no traditio, therefore ownership doesn't pass, therefore there's contractatio by the person who accepts the goods. That is certainly what I assumed when I described these texts a moment ago. But it may be that what mattered wasn't so much that as the simple fact that the purchaser had knowingly acquired something from the seller without the seller's consent. That was what made him a thief. So if this is right, it seems to me that Ulpianic furtum isn't, after all, the wrong of interfering with another's corporeal property, which is what contractatio itself seems to suggest. It's not something like trespass. It's not an interference wrong at all. It's the wrong of acquiring something from the plaintiff without his consent. So the absence of volition that we see spelled out in 47:2, 52:22 isn't just the inverse of a potential defense of consent. It is an essential element of the wrong. If you conceptualize theft in that way, if you abstract it in this way so that you can gather up all these difficult marginal cases which don't involve taking away or carrying off in any recognizable sense, you can comprise the theft of incorporeal property as well as corporeal property. That's why Ulpian seems to have thought you could steal genetic material or a debt. Now, as I say on my outline, it's easy to miss this because in the modern criminal law, it's absolutely uncontroversial that you can steal an incorporeal thing. No one bats an eyelid. But that's criminal law. And insofar as Ulpian is describing private law, albeit punitive penal private law, his analysis entails that acquiring something from someone else without their consent, even when that thing can't be handled or interfered with, gives rise to a corresponding right and duty on the part of the plaintiff or the defendant and the defendant respectively. And there I footnote OBG and Allen, which is the case that says there can be no conversion of contractual claims. And in the very last footnote, I reference my own work on this because this is the third in a sort of series of 3 pieces where I have tried to make this argument in respect of South African law. That was in 2021, and in respect of English law in a piece that is forthcoming. But this is actually the origin piece, even though it's coming out third, because it seems to me that Ulpian understood this perhaps before we did. Whether this could be actualized in the modern English law of tort or unjust enrichment is another question, but that's I think what Ulpian thought. So thank you very much. I've managed to do that in an hour. I'm sorry, that was very hard going. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Professor Scott. That was truly fascinating. We'll now take questions from those in person and online. David.
Sure was happening.
Say that again.
It sure was.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I realized as I went that that's for a rainy Tuesday in June. That's a strong meat.
2 points.
Yeah.
In 54.
Yes.
The mental state of the accomplice.
Yes.
You say with in order that the thieves it falls into the hands of thieves.
Yes.
Isn't it simply with the result that it falls in?
This is something that I have given some serious thought to, right? So the thing that's terribly difficult here is that without getting too technical, you've got result clauses and you've got purpose clauses. Yeah. And you've got more than one formulation. So some of the stuff is clearly purposive. So, for example, at one point we've got Ferti Faki Endikaza or some version of it in 54. It is indeed Ferti Faki Endikaza, and that's absolutely clearly for the purpose of committing a theft. But it's a lot less clear what's going on when it says ut in fures incideret. Let me see if I can scroll back up to that, actually, sorry. And again, I mean, this is something, and in fact, the same problem occurs in 51, where we get the same sort of formulation, si id cerca fuerit factum ut soci furarentur, and you have to make this difficult choice. What's going on here? So the conclusion I've reached is that in 51, we are clearly dealing with a purpose construction, even though it looks a bit like a result clause, right? But I think it must be conveying purpose there. And that was, I'm not going to blame Ben for that, but this is something that the two of us have discussed in some detail. But in 54, it seems to me that importantly, we're dealing at least in part with a result clause. So an actia furti lies against he who waved a red flag and put cattle to flight so that they fell into the hands of thieves, if indeed he did it for wrongful intent. Now, it seems to me that sense demands that that must be a result clause. So that's what happened. And there are 2 alternatives. The first alternative, he did it dolo malo. And then the second alternative, he did it for fun. So the result is static and the purpose, the mental state's different. That's how I've read the text. I'm very happy to be, it's not too late, despite what Joe says. I'm happy to be corrected. But this is something that I have thought about. And that's where I've landed. So again, I think that 51, that's purpose, but I think this one, ut in fures incideret, is a result clause. And I think there's only one, that's the only way to make sense of it. What do you think?
Sorry, I think in 54,
yeah,
it's the result clause.
Yes.
Because the purposive element has to be the dollar amount.
Yes.
For intent.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, did I misunderstand you? I think that's right. So are you thinking of 51 then?
No, I think 54. Why do I think you have it wrong? Sorry, I think you have it right.
Oh, well, good. That's okay. I think that must be right. In the paper, there's a footnote in which this is discussed.
See that it's important because what you've got is the generic dolus malus
Yeah.
as the mental element on the part of the accessory.
Yeah.
And then you've got the thieves who clearly have the animus furandi.
Yes.
Otherwise, they're not fures.
Yes. Yes.
And then that is linking with what you're saying with the 4 or 5 texts we've been looking at, the
Yes.
difficult ones.
Yes.
Where what Ulpian seems to be trying to do is get round this problem
Yes.
of who needs to have the animus
Yes.
furandi.
Yes. So this is the easy bit, right? So 50 is the easy bit. So we're just establishing what mental state accomplices, and then we kick that away, and then we get into the difficult stuff.
Yeah. It wanders around some other things from
Yes.
12 texts.
Yes.
That's why.
Yes.
And then you get the very difficult stuff. And I think it's all leading up to your last text about the slave.
Yes, 53. Oh, 23.
Because that's the situation where there is no relevant mental element
That's right.
on the part of the person who does the contractatio.
Yes, exactly so.
And this is a problem that we have in English law too, of accessorial liability,
Yes.
where the principal is not capable of committing the offence because there is some problem with the definition.
I see.
So the old case in the 70s, where a man induced his friend to have sex with his wife,
Right.
saying that the wife will love it really. And so there we've got the big problem as to who it is who is providing the physical element and who's providing the mental.
I see. Right.
So what you're getting with accessorial liability is you can have a complete disjunction between the physical element and the mental element.
Yes.
And that seems to be what's going on with the text we've been looking at.
With 23, Yeah, it may be that I'm trying to push it too far. So that may be where one should stop. That the point that Ulpian is making is that you can have, what should we call it? Animus furandi, full animus furandi in the sense of intention to steal for oneself on the part of one who provides only consilium, and then this, as you say, this accomplice mental state on the part of the person who provides the contractatio. I think that's exactly right. Now, whether we can then make that do what I'm trying to make it do, which is to suggest that Ulpian has this rather ambitious abstract conception of furtum, which is lurking behind these difficult cases. That I think is more of a stretch. But I think that is what 23 means, as I'm happy to hear you do.
Yeah, and I've not thought of it, but that clearly does seem to be right, and it's leading up to that.
Yes.
It's trying to work this out.
Okay, well, I'm pleased to hear you say that, because that's what I think. I think this is a very tight piece of analysis with very, very carefully worked out moving parts. So in another footnote, I get so excited that I do it algebraically. And say that there are actually 3 moving parts here. The first moving part is the conduct of the accomplice figure, and that's where the chasing and the lying and the persuading comes in. So that's A, B, B, C. And the second moving part is whether the conduct of the accomplice figure amounts to contractatio. So that's the sort of A, B, A, B. And then the third is the attention of the accomplice figure, whether they've got what I'm going to call full animus furandi, or merely some sort of a lesser intention to make another's gain. And then you've got an ABBA structure. And all those things, all those plates are spinning at one and the same time. And without doing a disservice to my predecessors who've thought about this text, I'm just not sure that people have really tried. So I think that people have been too quick to give up and say, oh, well, it's a mess. The compilers have had a go at it. All the stuff is spurious. All the references to animus furandi are spurious. Let's just go home. I just don't think that's right. I think it's absolutely rewarding if you pay careful attention to what he says. So thank you. I'm very pleased to hear you persuaded. Is that a hand?
Check out. Sensible hand. 52.7. The
yes. The one about hiding a pledge.
yeah.
Yeah.
Does that fair reanalysis in terms of your ultimate conclusions about who's doing what?
Yes, well, it doesn't involve more than 2 people, so it doesn't suit me very well. And it
Split the time period across two.
Yep. No, I agree. That is not an easy text for me to explain. So this is, I think, why Lionel thought that there was this very specific change of direction at 52.7. Shall I read the text? Sorry that we haven't actually, we haven't gone through that text. I'll just briefly read it. Creditor retains a pledged object after the debt has been paid and Upin approves Mellor's view that he's liable on that basis for theft if he acted calandi animo in order to conceal the object. So that's often comes up in articles about contract title because it seems to entail very little action. And it really does seem to be a definitional sort of text. It doesn't have any obvious affinity with the themes that I've tried to develop, which are these multi-party themes with multiple plaintiffs, multiple defendants, simulation, dissimulation. I don't know. Yeah.
Whether it might have some positive overlap with your thesis in terms of it wasn't wrong when you did it, when you handled it.
Yes.
And we see that again a bit later in the text that you have discussed.
Yes.
And also in the emphasis on the mental element, you've got the stronger calando.
Yes, well, indeed, the simulation.
Necessarily against you, but
No, that may be. But David's right when he says that it is very difficult to see where Upin is driving in that set of text. That's 52 Principium through to 52.18. There seems to be what looks to me like a loss of focus, which suggests to me I don't understand what's going on. Either that, or there has actually been some unsympathetic shortening, and unfortunately, I think we can't discount that possibility. So there are these very interesting thematic resonances, and Upin does seem to be circling back again and again to these really interesting cases about simulation and dissimulation. He's very interested in cases where you hand something to someone under the influence of a mistake, because those are really challenging cases. And of course, they're very challenging in modern law too. You've got to find where the limits of conversion or whatever it is you have to come up with a very nuanced conception of where you hit the limits of one tort and then tip over into another one, or out of liability completely. I mean, the reason I'm interested in this is because I'm interested in push and pull payment fraud in modern bank accounts, which is surprisingly under-regulated in the South African law and regulated almost exclusively through equity by trusts in the English law. And it seems to me that there must be a better answer out there somewhere. And I hope that it's Upin's answer. But yeah, that's a work in progress. Yeah.
I mean, apologies, it's way beyond my expertise. So what I say may sound a bit naive. So it's more of a clarificatory question about the slave case, like the number 23.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering whether the situation is you have person A, you have person B, slave belonging to a person B, but also there's documents belonging as well to the person B.
Yes.
You have a slave. Well, you have person A, person B, slave belonging to person B, and then you have some like person C who has the documents. Is it kind of one way or another?
You're right. It's actually really not at all clear what's going on there. So we don't know who owns the paper. We sort of assume it's the victim of the theft, but we're not told. It's very compressed. That's one reason why I gave you 27, because there you get this very nuanced, detailed account of exactly what's going on here. The other thing that's made it's not at all clear is what exactly the status of the document is. Yeah. So I think if you read 27, I think it's pretty clear that Upin regards it as exclusively evidentiary, and Paul as well. But I was a bit horrified to read a passage in Gaius's Institutes this afternoon where it's explicitly said that in the certainly in the law of peregrines, the carrier of this is dispositive, right? And I did just begin to wonder whether my assumptions here weren't a bit insecure, and whether it doesn't just require further. But Paul's treatment of that strongly suggests that they're thinking purely in terms of evidence, and I think that simplifies at least that aspect a little bit. But it isn't obvious.
Because like just a little follow up, if that's okay. Because I think if it's you know, if it's a situation when person B owns the documents, it's much more tricky to kind of reconcile with the rest of the passage than if
Yeah.
it was a person C. Because if
Yeah.
I was a person C, it's basically the case of the horses, but like a bit different, no?
All right, let me see if I've got this. So person C is an outsider.
Yeah,
Yeah.
outsider who owns the documents. The victim of
You
offense.
see, then the reason I think that would be very difficult is because even on the negative definition of contractility that Ulpin offers us, I'm not sure we could possibly come home there. And again, you do need contractility, but you need it because it's a necessary condition for liability. You don't need it because it's theft, but you do need it. So I think that would rule the case out. And that's why we never move completely into the realm of what I'm anachronistically calling incorporeal things. We only deal with incorporeal things that have a corporeal incarnation. So the debt is incarnated in the form of the document, even if that's merely evidentiary. And the stud, the genetic material, of course, has a physical emanation. So I think that's why that's why these cases are chosen, because Ulpin can't change contractility, and nor I think would you want to, because the proposal that I'm making here is totally unsustainable as a rule of criminal law. I mean, you need a marker, right, to know whether liability has begun. If you're going to start penalising people for attempts, for example, which you need to do in the Roman system, you need to know when. Whereas in the private law, it's less problematic. You just need to know whether there's been an successful abstraction of value. You can do that without a marker moment. So it seems to me that you absolutely do need something like contractility to make the criminal law work, even if you don't need it for the private.
Yeah, I'm sorry, again, they're just kind of a bit like obsessed with this case. Can it be said that there was contractatio because kind of a slave acts sort of like an extension of a person B?
Well,
person B did the
yeah, I think that is a view that is held by at least one other person in the room, and also I think in the literature. So there's I think it's a plausible view that the slave and the animals in 20 are some sort of extension of the body of the actor. I think that's maybe an easier argument to make about the animals. I think it does become problematic when it's someone else's slave who has agency and the capacity to commit a wrong, even though not in this case no liability attached. But I think that's certainly, to some extent, I'm afraid I've just winnowed out all these alternative views in order to try and make my argument. Leave.
It's about the stud case, because I've always struggled to see it as a case where if we're trying to find this evidence that you've made a gain, and we look at it as the theft of the genetic material, we're not told within that case whether or not the man does then get pregnant.
Yes.
We don't know.
Yes.
So I struggle to see how you're going to evidence a gain, because I mean, more than sort of a day afterwards, that genetic material has no use. You haven't
Unfortunately,
anything physical. So how do you think that balances with the idea that we don't move into incorporeal things like the right to manage your own stud and hire it out, all of that?
It doesn't. You're quite right. So my whole argument depends on a successful insemination, right? So my argument only works if the female animals are actually impregnated. If they're not, as you say, that their whole incorporeal structure collapses. So that has occurred to me as a footnote. I would only say that that the fact that Ulpin doesn't spell it out, the outcome perhaps suggests that it doesn't. Well, it probably suggests it doesn't matter. Yeah, which is against me, I think. But I didn't read you the text. I mean, my Greek is not good enough. Tes gones tum taxit charin. Not sure exactly whether that implies anything. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just means what it's said to mean here. Yeah. We just don't know. Yeah, you're quite right. I'm afraid. Yeah.
And just to follow on from the point about 23, I think instrumentum there probably points to the evidential value of the document, because in the civil proceedings at the editio in Ure, you would present your instrumenta, which are the sort of evidential documents that you intend to rely on later.
Yes.
So if you can't present that that document, even if it's not dispositive, then
Yes.
it's a problem potentially for your case.
Yes, instrumented, that's very useful. Thank you, because this is something that's given me tremendous difficulty to the correct translation of these terms and exactly how they relate to one another, because there's rationes, there's instrumentum, there's documenta somewhere or other, and then there's the tablets, literal, and I fiddle around with this endlessly and eventually landed there, but that is useful, and thank you.
The hieroglypher and the additional text,
Yes.
because they firstly you present them at the ECO, but also the value that Olpin talks about of the debtor wanting the return of the document is because in 214 we're told that the return of the document would give rise to a tacit agreement not to sue.
Right.
So if the debtor can present the chirograph, then that is evidence of a tacit agreement by the creditor not to sue.
Yes.
Because normally they would be destroyed at the end of the on the termination of the relationship.
All right, that's very interesting.
Because usually they're held by a third party in a jury or banker of some sort.
I'm just going to scroll, please forgive me, but to 27 again. That's very useful.
But anyway, but you said that's not the main point.
No, but it's very important. It's just unfortunately not even in the paper. I'm afraid it's not possible to develop this properly, and it doesn't help that these texts are rather difficult to translate. At least they're difficult to translate for me. I've been working with, the existing English language translations and trying to improve on them with help. But it's actually not at all obvious what Olpin is saying. So that kind of extrinsic evidence is incredibly helpful to illuminate the precise nature of the difficulties here. Again, there's a whole chunk in 1 and 2, which I haven't included, where there's a tremendous amount of subtlety around different types of documents, as you say, and the different scenarios. Thank you.
So that wasn't a question. That's one point. Can I ask about to go back to the point about the formula? And,
yes.
Because that's a very interesting sort of proposition that the formula is different from the one that Lane thought. I just wondered, I mean, Lane's kind of his basic, the steps that he makes are that we're looking, I suppose, at the edictal mass when we get to these texts.
Yes.
That the formula is in the edict.
Yes.
And so that's the point at which you come across complicity, which is in the formula.
That's the assumption, I think, yeah.
And so that you have this structure in text.
Yes.
Structured.
Yes.
I just wonder with Plachet's formula,
yes,
if there's no mention of complicity,
yes,
because if we're looking at text from the edictal mass, and it's fairly typical in other titles that you get to those texts, discuss the formula after you get to texts, that discuss, say, for example, the Praetor's Edict, which is that here because it's Furton. So what the anchor is for the discussion of complicity if it's not in the formula?
Well, I suppose my argument is that it's all about the formula. So the formula is the occasion for the discussion of complicity, but nothing. It's not commenting on a specific series of words in the formula that refer to complicity. So there are two versions of my argument. The more moderate one is that Plachek is right, and that the whole thing is about Furtum Factum Esse. And the more radical view is that this isn't lemmatic. But that's it's obviously it would need to be tested against other pieces of that are comparable. But the difficulty is we don't actually have a lot of Book 37 and dictum, and the Actio 30 is quite idiosyncratic, isn't it? Insofar as there is this civil law base, and then but in order to make that argument with any seriousness, one would need to make comparisons with other parts of a much wider series of comparisons with other parts of Olpin ad edictum. I mean, certainly, obviously, the one that we're all familiar with because we teach it is the lemmatic commentary on 9.2, and that in Book 18 ad edictum, and that clearly is lemmatic, right? It's signaled so obviously. And when you contrast the text we've been talking about today with the large portions of Book 18 ad edictum that are excerpted in 9.2, the contrast is very marked. And I mean, of course, a lex is not a formula, but it seems to me there's not much here to suggest a lemmatic commentary. So it's maybe something to think about in the future. But thank you.
If there are no further questions, we might finish up there. Please do come to the granter and please join me again in thanking Professor. Thank you.